Indonesian films have existed for just about 100 years. And over that time, it's gone through many changes. It's gone through highs and lows. And some films become national treasures while others get lost through the passage of time. But in this video, we're going to talk about them all, the good and the bad. And who knows, maybe at the end of this video, you'll find a newfound respect for Indonesian films and would like to fill in my form. I'm not joking. (1926) Loetong Kasarong, or Go to the House, directed by L. Vilvendorp, and G. Kruger's black and white film produced by NV Java Film Company. It is considered the first documented Indonesian film, as it was the first to showcase Indonesian people on film and had an indigenous cast. The film was a success during its screenings in Bandung, as it was in theaters from the 31st of December 1926 to the 6th of January 1927. In areas outside of Bandung, the film was not well received due to its rural background of being a folk story. (1927) To atone for the loss of profit, Vilvendorp had to finance Eulis Adjih, directed and shot by Krugers. The earnings from Eulis Adjih was enough to make up for the lost profit of Loetong Kasarong. The film was later remade in 1954 by R.D. Arifin, which became a success in Singapore. 1930s. Bakhtiar Effendi is credited as the first native Indonesian director, as he made his film debut in 1932 in a film called Njai Dasima. He then indulged into the press world, only to return in 1950 to direct 3 films in Indonesian for the PFN, the National Film Company. 1942 to 1945, pre-independence. Indonesia's film landscape drastically shifted during the 1940s, when the Dutch, who had colonized Indonesia for over 300 years, had been driven out by the Japanese during the Second World War. The Japanese invaded Indonesia in 1942. The Indonesian nationalist parties were complicit to Japan due to their belief that they would gain independence once Japan had won the war in Asia. Under Japan, Indonesia were forced into labor, working to provide material gains for the Japanese. During this time, the Indonesian film industry were heavily restricted. The only films Indonesians viewed during that period were films produced by the Japanese and pre-existent Indonesian films. Western-made films were banned by the Japanese due to their anti-war sentiments at the time. The films were not restricted, bore themes of Japanese propaganda with the goal of promoting Japanese ideals and the incentive of enlisting into the Japanese army. 1945 to 1949, post-independence. In 1945, Japan had surrendered their control over Indonesia following the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, along with other factors including a military attack by the Soviet Union in Manchuria and financial burdens from the Second World War, which provided leeway for Indonesia to proclaim their independence on the 17th of August 1945. The Dutch then attempted to regain control over Indonesia after the proclamation with the aid of the British. In 1947, the Dutch formulated the Linggarjati Agreement, where the Dutch would gain control over Java, Madura, and Sumatra. The Dutch did not fully go through with the agreement, as they wanted to put together a federal country to weaken the Republic of Indonesia. During this period, Indonesia's resources were being utilized by the Dutch. Military aggression continued with the Dutch's 21st July 1947 attack on Indonesia regions with 100,000 intelligence officers and other military equipment. Although the Indonesians were outnumbered, they did not surrender their strive for independence. Under General Sudirman, the military were able to retain the Indonesian Republic. The Dutch faced backlash from the attack, being deemed as inhumane, which led the UN to put an end to the war, which forced the Dutch to stop the aggression. During this 3-year period, Indonesian cinema was at a halt. Although within those 3 years, groups of artists started to emerge that brought the spirit of combatants fighting within the war. R.M. Sutarto managed to seize control of Nippon Aigasha, a Japanese propaganda film company, and turned it into the Berita Film Indonesia, which translated into Indonesian Film News. In 1948, the Dutch took control of BFI and turned it into SPFC, the South Pacific Film Corp, which enlisted Atjar Asmara to direct Jauh Mata, with Usmar Ismail as the assistant director, a figure that will come into prominence shortly. Later, Asmara left the corp after his second film. The war had cost the lives and infrastructure of Indonesia, but it had also caused Indonesia's spirit of revolution and nationalism to skyrocket, with Indonesia finally instigating its full independence in 1949. Up until the 1950s, the films that were being produced in Indonesia were by Dutch and Chinese. Usmar Ismail is largely celebrated as the godfather of Indonesian cinema. The release of his debut feature, Darah, or also known as The Long March, was made Native Films Day in Indonesia. Ismail made the film under his film company Perfini. Ismail's films often dealt with the themes of love, social justice, and adapting to independence, but most of all, Usmar Ismail's films were centralized on nationalism. His first film was funded by his own money and was not made to be a commercial success, as it was overshadowed by imported nationalist films that dominated the Indonesian market during the early 50s. Ismail and his best friend Jamaluddin Malik then came up with the Indonesian Film Festival, FFI, to introduce the Indonesian public to Indonesian films. Ismail's second film, Lewat Jam Malam, After the Curfew, in 1954, won the festival and would later represent Indonesia in the Asian Film Festival. The film was a commercial and critical success, now regarded as one of the best Indonesian films ever made. The film follows a war veteran that attempts to reintegrate himself into society after the revolution, which ended Dutch military rule in 1949. The film is filled with anti-war messaging through its trauma and vanity within the protagonist, Iskandar, because of war. The film stands firmly on nationalist ideals and benefited from the boost of Indonesian nationalism from that era. The film was later restored in May of 2012 during Martin Scorsese's World Cinema Project, which aimed to restore endangered films that represented cultures all around the world. By 1955, Indonesian productions was at a high point and reached the peak of 59 film titles. His next film, a comedy called Tamu Agung, 1955, was a flop, as audiences at the time couldn't pick up on the film's political undertones and brought Vini to the brink of bankruptcy. It wasn't until Tiga Darah in 1956 that Ismail would gain and receive a commercial success from his films, which persisted to the 60s. During the 1960s, politics started to seep into the world of film. In 1961, the Indonesian Communist Party had deemed the monopoly that the anti-communist European and American films had on Indonesia as unjust, which made the government, the American Motion Picture Association Indonesia, AMPAI. The peak of the PKI's involvement in politics came on May 9th, 1964. The PKI launched Papvias, which basically boycotted and stopped showings of films from the United States in favor of films from Russia, China, and Eastern Europe. This lasted until the government banned the PKI following the events of G30S in 1965, where 7 generals were killed under mysterious circumstances. The aging president of Indonesia, Sukarno, then signed the Supersemar letter, which gave Suharto emergency powers to resolve the G30S massacre, which included banning communism, marking the start of President Suharto's new order. If you were wondering about Usmar Ismail and what he was doing at this time, he became a member of the DPR, Indonesian Parliament, from 1966 to 1969 under the new order. In 1966, the government was attempting to piece the Indonesian film industry back together through the means of allowing imported films to be screened in Indonesia. The the funds of the venture used for the creation of national films under the FN. This allowed imported films to be easily accessible and cheap under the free market. Due to this, the censorship during this period was lenient to improve the industry. These foreign films were outpoured with graphic and violent films. While this is the case for imported material, Indonesian films were still under tight censorship. Even the introduction of theaters that only showed Indonesian films did not help Indonesian films in the national film box office. 1970s. In 1970s, the government conceded and gave less stricter guidelines for Indonesian cinema. This rejuvenated film production in Indonesia as it grew rampant. Low-budget films were filled with profanity and violence. Meanwhile, on the 8th of June 1970, Usmar Ismail passed away, and in the following year, January 2nd, Jamaluddin Malik would also pass away. Two of Indonesia's cinema's most celebrated minds were gone. The decade also marked the age of experimentation for Indonesian cinema, but Hollywood, Hong Kong, and Indian cinema were still dominating the screens in Indonesia due to the FN used the funds from the foreign films to double the production of Indonesian films and allowed for their films in theaters to last longer than imported films. 1980s came a wave of graphic and explicit Indonesian films that were at its peak during this era. This was Indonesia's way of rebelling and coping to President Suharto's straightening New Order regime. Rapi Films were credited as the biggest Indonesian film studio during the 80s, with low budgets and constant production. Indonesia's obsession with horror is pinpointed to start in this era of Indonesian cinema. The founder of Rapi Films explains that the superstitious Indonesian majority were appealed to the mysticism of the genre and good conquering evil. This genre of film was also cheap and easy to produce, which coincided with the demographics' interests. The provocative nature of these films was what made the audience cling to the genre. The lower middle class saw the film as a form of escapism from the real world. Beri Prima and Suzana were known as the most prolific actors in this era. These audiences were still keen to watch important films, and the rise of cable TV had harmed the film industry in Indonesia tremendously. 1990s. 1997, the Asian financial crisis had turned the Indonesian rupiah from 2,000 for 1 USD to 16,000 to 1 USD overnight, as Indonesia switched from a fixed to floating currency, which caused interest rates to increase by 70% over a 3-year period, causing poverty and an economic crisis to ensue in Indonesia. This was escalated by the mysterious killings of 4 students attending Trisakti. Furthermore, anti-Chinese sentiments started growing during this period as they were targeted and blamed for the crisis. Thus, in May of 1998, riots began. The houses of ethnically Chinese were burnt and robbed. The riots resulted in President Suharto's resignation after around 30 years of presidency and the start of the Reformation era of Indonesian history. The 2000s marked a new chapter of Indonesian cinema after its collapse during the financial crisis. The Indonesian film industry became freer with themes that spoke against corruption, poverty, and the importance of human rights. This age was marked as the Indonesian New Wave. Rising auteurs like the legend Riri Riza came from this era, with films like Petualangan Sherina in the 2000s and Apa Dengan Cinta in 2002 that defined Indonesian cinema for decades to come. Other films like Laskar Pelangi were able to achieve commercial success due to their appeal towards the teen demographic. Critics also helped to maintain the qualities of films within the era, and the Indonesian cinema was on a rise nationally. 2010s. The 2010s in Indonesia marked the beginning of remakes, sequels, and the rise of streaming services like Netflix, which made promoting Indonesian cinema easier. Viral marketing and word of mouth were detrimental to the success of a film. International acclaimed films like The Raid, directors like Joko Anwar and Ernest Prakasa had their break in this decade with modern classics like Impetigore and Pengabdi Setan. that got a sequel in 2022. Ernest Prakasa with Cek Toko Sebelah 2016, that got a sequel in 2022. And Agak Laen 2024, just last year. There's no way there's a sequel for this film that was made just last year, right? Oh. 2020s. This decade marks the peak of Indonesian sequels and trilogies, but this era brought Indonesian into the works of directors like Yanni Lawrence with his original works like Satu Kakak Tujuh Keponakan, Jatuh Cinta Seperti film. Indonesian films has shifted and changed over the last century, facing highs and low points, but the public's love for the film never dissipates. They were always fighting for something new in film, innovations that made the medium exciting for new generations of viewers to enjoy. But to what extent does Indonesian films get credit for internationally? Aside from a few outliers, how far has Indonesian films broken into the mainstream? And does Indonesian films have a cohesive identity after being broken down and put together again, over and over again, over the last century? Those questions should be debated on, as through discourse and discussion, change can be made for Indonesian films to move again, bettering itself. The future of the industry is unknown, but to celebrate its past as futile for the subsequent future that it holds.